Good afternoon and welcome to DCR's Q&A virtual lunch hour for the month of February. I'm your host, Jason Colleen. I'm an Assistant Executive Director with the Department of Cannabis Regulation. I would just like to remind folks that the department is going to be opening up our social equity individual applicant verification filing period on March 17th. The filing period will be open until 4 p.m. on April 1st, 2025. This is an opportunity for folks that have not been previously verified to get verified for calendar year 2025 to participate in the upcoming Phase 3 Retail Round 3 lottery. And folks that were previously verified in 2019 or 2022 are grandfathered in and do not have to get re-verified in order to participate in Phase 3 Retail Round 3. We do have a number of webinar resources available on the DCR website. Once we get this PowerPoint presentation posted, you can see that we do have links to each of those presentations. We did the most recent social equity verification webinar yesterday, and that's available on our website. And with that, we can hop into the questions.
Good afternoon, Jason. Our first question comes from John J. How do we qualify for the 10,000 cannabis equity tax credit with the franchise tax board? Do we need to reapply for re-verification during the March 17th application period to qualify for this tax credit, or is being approved in the past the only qualification needed?
So DCR, the Department of Cannabis Regulation, does not have a formal role in the administration of this program. A qualified taxpayer that's an equity licensee with the Department of Cannabis Control would be eligible for these tax credits. The Department of Cannabis Control provides the Franchise Tax Board with a list of qualified taxpayers who are identified as social equity applicants. If you're not on the Department of Cannabis Control's list, and the Department of Cannabis Control reaches out to DCR, we can confirm whether or not your local record qualifies as social equity. But the Franchise Tax Board doesn't get a list from DCR. You have to be on the Department of Cannabis Control list. So I would reach out to the Department of Cannabis Control or the Franchise Tax Board to see whether or not you're on their list.
A follow-up question from John J. Is it possible to obtain the vendor compensation with the CDTFA? This year, where eligible cannabis retailers may be approved to retain 20% of the cannabis excise tax.
Yeah, again, the vendor compensation program with the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration requires you to be a cannabis retailer that's approved by the Department of Cannabis Control, which is the state agency. So you need to make sure that you're approved by the Department of Cannabis Control and they've confirmed your qualified status before claiming a vendor compensation credit. That program does run through the end of this calendar year. So it's in your best interest to reach out directly to the Department of Cannabis Control and CDTFA.
Ariel J., when will DCR issue the 2025 renewed license certificate?
The plan is to begin issuing 2025 licenses in March of 2025 after we complete our renewal reconciliation.
Next question, Zenit L. Do you have an update on cannabis lounges?
The City Council has initiated the legislative process for this matter. We think that the matter will start to be heard in City Council policy committees in the coming months. At this time, a formal policy has not been adopted.
From Amanda B. Could you provide guidance on what happens if an application is considered abandoned or remains stuck at the environmental review stage? Additionally, what steps can be taken to reactivate or ensure the application moves forward in the queue?
I interpret it as two separate processes. So if an application is considered abandoned, that application, for all intents and purposes, is closed. Um, when a record has been abandoned, it may or may not be eligible for refiling. In order for it to be eligible for refiling, the application had to have been deemed filed before it was abandoned. Um, if you're eligible to refile, then you would begin a new application process. Separately, for records that are at the environmental review stage, businesses that have a state provisional license are being converted from provisional licensure to annual licensure with the assistance of the local jurisdiction assistance grant award. Separately, businesses that don't have a state provisional may request an invoice for their environmental review fees before the end of this month, and either late this month or late in March or early April, DCR will begin issuing invoices to all of the applicants that don't have a state provisional license for folks to pay the corresponding environmental review fees and move their application forward.
Thank you. Question from Logan F. When will LADCR release the annual permits to those who have expired permits? Any communication that permits that have expired at the end of December 2024 are extended until annuals are released for those who have been approved and paid?
The 2025 licenses are going to begin to be issued on a rolling basis in March.
From Amanda B. For new applicants who submitted their application approximately 2 years ago, what is a typical timeline for receiving an NOE or notice of exemption?
So for the applicants that have a state provisional license, those applicants are being converted over on a rolling basis based on the expiration date of their state provisional license. And the department is utilizing local jurisdiction assistance grant funds to facilitate that transition. For applicants that don't have a state provisional license, folks can request an invoice to pay their environmental review fees. Otherwise, we'll begin issuing invoices for these environmental review fees in late March or early April. Until the environmental review fees are paid and the analysis is done, we can't determine whether or not your project qualifies for a notice of exemption.
From Alexis B. When will Phase 3, Round 1 social equity applicants be allowed to sell or transfer their 51% dispensary ownership stake to non-social equity applicants and general applicant entities?
So the Los Angeles Municipal Code does not currently allow a social equity license to be converted to a non-social equity license. That's a policy consideration that may be taken up by policymakers later this year, but I don't have a time frame for if or when that will become local law.
Question from Leo L. Once an applicant received its DCC license and Metric C account, but is waiting for temporary approval from LADCR, would there be any issues as to why the Metric C isn't being used in that time period?
That would be a good question for the Department of Cannabis Control, just in terms of whether or not you as a business have to report zero activity for the time period where you don't have both a City of Los Angeles and a State of California license.
And this is a follow-up from Leo L. Is there a deadline for using Metric C account?
The State of California does have requirements for recording information into Metric, and it would be a violation of the department's rules and regulations for not recording the required information in Metric.
Question from Sophia S. I don't meet social equity individual applicant criteria. Are there other ways I can secure a retail cannabis license in Los Angeles County?
At the moment, we're not accepting retail storefront or type 10 applications from non-social equity applicants. There are other jurisdictions that do have application processes open. Los Angeles County is exploring allowing folks to apply for various commercial cannabis activities. And then, of course, the exclusivity period on the Type 10 application does expire at the end of the calendar year. So non-social equity individual applicants may be able to use the public convenience or necessity process to apply for a Type 10 license sometime in calendar year 2026.
Paula B. asks, for licensees with temporary approval that have ownership changes that need to be reported to DCR, can we submit those ownership modifications now, or is it best to wait until CEQA notices of exemption are issued for these licenses in question?
I think that's a two-pronged question. Applicants and licensees have a duty to report ownership changes to DCR and submit modifications to reflect those changes. Any changes in ownership must be approved by the department. So if you're making changes and later on unable to get the necessary documentation to us, your records won't be updated. Separately, depending on the type of ownership change, it may not be a mere ownership change where equity is moving between existing owners or, an owner is being removed from the record and a new owner is coming in. Entity substitutions where, the actual applicant or the business entity that has the license is being changed requires the submission of a new application. Of course, because there has to be a new application there, that would require a separate application process, separate environmental review, and then separate approval process. So if it's merely an ownership modification where maybe one owner is selling, 20% of their equity to another owner, then DCR can still continue forward with processing the application. If it's an ownership change that changes the makeup of the equity share related criteria, we would suspend processing of the application until we've reviewed the ownership modification and then determine that that modification does comply with Municipal Code Section 10420. So it's really case specific in terms of whether or not submitting an ownership modification may impact your application processing. It would be best to reach out to your analyst so that they can look at your specific circumstance and what you're planning to submit. And then we can provide, updated information. But submitting an ownership modification, which is prospective, that hasn't happened yet, may impact application processing, which ultimately could impact when DCR can complete the environmental review and maybe issue a notice of exemption. Entity changes, of course, will impact application processing. And if the ownership change has already happened, it is the applicant or licensee's responsibility to report that to DCR before those changes go into effect.
Our next question comes from Jorge T. Will people previously verified as social equity in 2019 need to pay the verification fee for the upcoming verification round?
I'm going to take it as two separate questions. So the municipal code was updated in December 2024 to allow DCR to do another verification based on what we're calling the 2025 criteria. That policy did grandfather folks that were verified in 2019 and or 2022 that status into allowing them to participate in phase 3 retail round 3. So currently an individual who was verified in 2019, 2022, or 2025 would be eligible to participate in the lottery for the Type 10 licenses later this year. The 2019 verification in and of itself is unrelated to the 2025 verification process. If you wanted to get verified under the 2025 criteria, you would have to submit a verification request and pay the verification fee. But if you were verified in 2019 or 2022, you don't have to get re-verified to participate in this year's lottery.
Another question from Jorge T. I've noticed that many daycare centers were removed from the latest sensitive use map update. Did the criteria change for what qualifies as a daycare? Is the current map accurate?
So the DCR licensing map is merely a tool to help members of the public identify things that may potentially be sensitive uses. It is up to the prospective applicant to do their own due diligence to look to identify if there are sensitive uses within 700 feet of their proposed business premises location. The daycare center layer was refreshed earlier this month with data from February 1st of 2025. The only change that we did before rendering the layer is we focused in on the zip codes that were within LA and adjacent to LA. So zip codes for like Montclair, for Covina, those were backed out of the data before we rendered the layer.
A question from John. Is there an advantage to getting re-verified in the upcoming verification window?
It's a personal decision. The code allows for somebody verified in 2019 or 2022 to participate in the Type 10 lottery later this year. Currently, there's not a restriction for prospective applications that does require a 2025 verification. So at the moment, there's not a requirement for anybody to get re-verified to participate in any of the application processes that are contemplated for this calendar year.
Question from MS. If a local licensee has approval for a medium-sized cultivation license, but the licensee is initially only going to build out 10,000 square feet of canopy, at a later date, build out another 10,000 square foot of canopy, thus they would like to apply for two different small-sized licenses with DCC. Would DCR confirm each of DCC's local approval inquiries?
Can you repeat the question one more time?
Sure. If a local licensee has approval for a medium-sized cultivation license, but the licensee is initially only going to build out 10,000 square feet of canopy, and then later, at a later date, build out another 10,000 square feet of canopy, would DCR confirm each of DCC's local approval inquiries for the two different small size licenses?
Most likely, yes. The DCR's approval of a medium cultivation license would allow the licensee to cultivate up to 22,000 square feet of canopy. When we confirm whether or not local compliance is underway with the Department of Cannabis Control, we're confirming the activity. So we're letting the Department of Cannabis Control that local compliance is underway for cultivation. We're not specifically, calling into question the size of the license type that the person's applying for with the state. If you were issued a medium license and a small license, and those are the only licenses you hold, you would be capped at 10,000 square feet of canopy because you have to go based on the more restrictive of the two licenses. Assuming that it's the same applicant, the same legal business premises address, and the business premises on file with us that's been approved would allow for up to 20,000 square feet of canopy. we wouldn't have an issue with confirming two separate small licenses with the DCC. But when it comes down to it, you may have to have your DCC analyst reach out to your DCR analyst to verify that those two licenses would fall within the footprint of what's authorized by the Department of Cannabis Regulation. So this hypothetical scenario would work, but it may require communication between DCC and DCR if you were to try to implement it.
Question from John. If our 2019 SEIA status says SEP Tier 1 and 2 qualified, and our 2022 SEIA status says pending request, is there any need or reason to want to also be qualified or verified in 2022?
If your 2019 SEI status says SEP Tier 1 and 2 qualified, you were verified in 2019. If your 2022 status does not reflect a tier, then you were not verified in 2022, and DCR is not reviewing any of those verification requests. If the intent is to, register for the 2025 Type 10 lottery, you would be able to do that with just your 2019 status. Folks that are verified may only register once for the lottery, regardless of how many times they were verified by the department.
Thank you, Jason. I think we have one more in the queue. Actually, I misread that. There are no more questions in the queue. Sorry about that.
Okay. This was an easy week for me then. I want to thank everybody for coming out, and our next Q&A virtual lunch will take place on Wednesday, March 26th at noon. And just keep an eye out on the department's website. There's a bunch of different webinars in addition to these Q&A sessions that are going on. And Dr. Brown and the social equity team are also doing various webinars. So, keep an eye out. There's a lot of stuff going on. We'll use these sessions to kind of answer general questions or program related questions, but we do have webinars that are focused on specific application types, verification types, and programming. So please continue to update refresh your department webpage and make sure that you're checking out all the stuff going on. So thank you again and have a great day.